Cassidy, who is the President and CEO of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis. It's a nonprofit think tank focused on providing independent research analysis and public education on budget and tax issues, with an emphasis on the impact that financial decisions have on low and moderate income Virginians. Prior to joining the Institute, he was an analyst with the Virginia Department of Planning and Budget. He's also worked for several years with the Office of Management and Budget under the Executive Office of the President of the United States. Graduated from Georgetown University and received a master's degree in public policy from the College of William & Mary. Please welcome Michael Cassidy.
Thank you, Congressman Scott. It's my pleasure to be here with you all tonight and to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities facing Virginia's economy. And I'd like to start off the discussion with some information around the jobs picture in particular, because I think that is really so central to the budget deficit discussions and arguments that we're having. And for us to focus on what the challenges in that element of our economy and federal and state fiscal policies will help us go a long way to really understanding the true challenges before us. So one key element of the current challenge is the continued high rates of unemployment. But when we look at not only just those who are unemployed, but also those who are marginally attached to the workforce and those who are working part-time for economic reasons, but they'd rather be working full-time and they just can't find full-time job. That gives us a good snapshot of the total picture of sort of distressed workers in our economy. And what this slide shows is how that percentage of the workforce remains at historically very high levels. The gray sections in this graph show the official period of recessions, going back to the mid-90s and forward. And so you see the official recession was from December of 2007 till June of 2009. And we're now beyond that, obviously 2 years, but that bar, that red line, still remains quite elevated, with large segments of our labor force being either unemployed, marginally attached, or wanting to work more but can't find a job to bring them more hours. We also continue to have high numbers of job seekers for the job openings that are out there. So nationally, overall, we see that we continue to have more than 4 job seekers per every job opening out in the economy. And in the southern region of the country, of which Virginia is a part, we don't have state-specific data on this point, it's about 4.6. So about 4.6 job seekers for every job opening that is out there in the economy. So continued lack of demand for workers in the economy. One of the key challenges that these high rates of unemployment and continued high levels of distress among the labor force invite is the question of whether it's some kind of structural issue in the economy. Sometimes when you have a period of recession and economic recovery, there can be a large number of unemployed workers, but then you have a large number of job openings, but those businesses need a different skill set than the folks who are unemployed. And that would be a very important issue for us to understand, because the kinds of policy responses you have to solve that kind of a problem are things like helping them get retrained and get the new skills that they need for the job openings that are out there. But when you look at what's going on currently in the economy, you still see that really the key issue remains a lack of demand. What this chart does is it tracks by different sectors, which runs down the left bar, so mining and lodging, construction, manufacturing. The number of unemployed workers in those sectors, those are the red bars. And then the blue bars are the number of job openings in that sector. And these are the major sectors of the American economy. And as you can see from this graph, no sector has more job openings than unemployed workers. And so I don't believe this is a structural issue going on in the American economy, where somehow unemployed workers don't have the skills that companies are looking for in their job openings. We just flat out don't have enough job openings in any sector to help meet the needs of the large number of unemployed in those sectors. And so when we think about these national numbers and look at the very serious challenges that face us nationally, that of course would invite consideration of what's happening here in Virginia. The challenges here in Virginia are also quite serious. this chart shows what the current jobs gap is in Virginia. And this analysis shows, we estimate at my shop, our current jobs shortfall exceeds 296,000 in the Commonwealth. That means we're going to have to create 296,000 new jobs just to return to pre-recession employment levels in the Commonwealth. That's made up of two factors. One is this red zone in the graph. That charts, that squiggly line in black that runs down the bottom is just the collapse of the employment market in this state due to the recession. So we've lost a tremendous amount of jobs since the recession began. The green, however, represents the fact that on top of our challenge of growing new jobs to replace the ones we flat out lost, we also have seen the working age population in Virginia increase 4.5% since the recession began in December of 2007. So we got to not only find jobs, make jobs for the ones we flat out lost, but also for that bigger working age population. And together, it combines to be about 296,000 jobs. Our job recovery has been quite sluggish here in the Commonwealth. In fact, the latest jobs numbers show that we haven't made any significant progress in job creation in Virginia since the official end of the recession, all the way back in June of 2009. That's because total employment at the end of the recession was 3.6 million jobs. The latest jobs numbers show we've got total employment of about 3.6 million jobs. We aren't creating jobs to even keep up with the growth of the working age population in the state, and so this gap will remain quite large in Virginia. One element of the recession is that it decimated wages for large components of our labor force here in the state. What this graph represents is what's happened to the wages by different sectors of the labor force. Folks with less than a high school education on the left, high school education, folks with some college, or folks with a bachelor's degree or higher. Virginia is charted in the red here, and the rest of the United States is in green. Since 2007, so since the recession, we saw significantly higher declines in the median wages for folks with less than a high school or a high school degree or some college, even than we did in the rest of the country. But we saw continued increases in wages for folks with a bachelor's degree or higher. So the Virginia economy, that segment of the labor force has been able to weather the recession much better in terms of actually seeing wage growth during the recession, whereas the other parts of our labor force have really seen some very significant setbacks in terms of their wages. And those setbacks are even bigger than the kinds that we see nationally. These kinds of trends with regard to what the recession itself wrought on our labor market sit on top of historically high levels of income inequality that existed even before the recession. What this graph shows is that ratio between what the highest wage workers in Virginia's economy are earning and what the lowest wage workers are earning. And we are at the highest rates of income inequality here in the state than we've seen since we started keeping records on this stuff back in 1979. In fact, only New Jersey has higher rates of income inequality than does Virginia when you look at what the highest wage workers are earning versus the lowest wage ones. Again, we're charted here in red, and the nation as a whole is in green, and so our levels of income inequality are exceeding that for the nation as a whole, and as I mentioned, only one state, in fact, outpaces us by that measure. And so I think when we think about the long-term deficit reduction, keeping a focus on job creation being the center of the challenges facing us is really important. Long-term deficit reduction and job creation don't really conflict, because the way that we're going to get our, a key component of how we can get our federal budget in balance is to get people back to work. When they're back to work, they're earning wages, they're paying income tax, they are buying things. And so that boosts demand for other products and services throughout the economy. And so I think one of the key elements is that we can and we should do both. Focus on reducing the jobs deficit and figure out strategies for long-term deficit reduction, but not one at the exclusion of the other. The other thing I think that came out of a lot of what Congressman Scott shared was the need for a more balanced approach to deficit reduction. new revenues really do have to be part of the solution, because if not, then the entire burden of deficit reduction is going to be on lower and middle income families. And that's really not right at a time when poverty, particularly deep poverty, is at record highs in America, and income inequality is at the worst levels that we've seen nationally since the Great Depression. The other challenge, I think, is making sure that we understand the very important role that key safety net programs have played in helping keep more Americans out of poverty. And therefore, when we think about deficit reduction strategies, we need to focus on how to protect those programs. This next slide shows the millions of Americans that were kept out of poverty in 2010 by key federal safety net programs. So on the left is unemployment insurance. 3.2 million people kept out of poverty in 2010 by unemployment insurance compensation. The middle bar, the earned income tax credit, 5.4 million people kept out of poverty because of that key targeted refundable federal tax credit program. And on the right bar, food stamps, now called SNAP, where 3.9 million people were kept out of poverty through that program. And so understanding that deficit reduction should not increase poverty or income inequality, especially when they have a proven track record of helping people stay out of poverty, is something I think also to keep in mind in terms of how to strategize around efforts to reduce the budget deficit long term. Here in Virginia, we have, I think, a particular challenge when it comes to understanding the possible implications of federal budget deficit reduction strategies. That's because a large segment of Virginia's economy is quite dependent on the federal government. For example, when you look at the sources of personal income in Virginia, direct federal payments accounts for over 45% of personal income in our state. That is through direct civilian and military employment, through federal retirement, Social Security, disability payments. This is direct. This isn't indirect stuff of the wages and earnings of government contractors or things like that. Just merely direct payments from the federal government. And so when we think about what strategies we need to use to reduce the budget deficit, I think in Virginia in particular, we need to be attentive to their outsized impacts they could have on our economy because of how closely linked we are to the federal government. And therefore, thinking about what the size of the cuts, what the structure of those kind of cuts are we going to cut defense procurement? Are we going to cut Social Security and Medicare? And what the timing of those cuts are all very essential questions for us to ask in terms of understanding that. But on top of how those kinds of strategies could have an impact on Virginia because of our particular relationship with the federal government and federal employment and procurement, is we ourselves are facing significant and ongoing budget shortfalls at the state level. As you might recall, states have to balance their budget every year. They can't run deficits like the federal government. And in Virginia, we are facing an $800 million shortfall in the upcoming 2-year budget. Many of you may have seen in the news announcements of a recent budget surplus. That was for the fiscal year that ended on June 30th, where the governor announced $544 million surplus booked in that fiscal year. Well, the challenge is right now the governor and his staff are sitting down to write the upcoming budget. And that's the budget that the General Assembly is going to grapple with come January when they're in session. And when you do just a very conservative estimate about what that needs of the community are, as we've done at my shop, you see an estimated $800 million shortfall going forward. That's just by accounting for taking the state's own 6-year financial plan, adjusting it for the enacted levels of the budget, and then adjusting it for latest revenues. So how we deal with this shortfall through a cuts-only approach that maybe continues to cut programs and services to people at the state level, on top of the challenges that we face in terms of how we grapple with the federal budget deficit, are, I think, front and center the kinds of key policy issues we face here at the state level in terms of figuring out what kind of a state do we want for ourselves and our children, and how do we adopt the strongest policies to secure a prosperous future for the Commonwealth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just noticed that Cliff Hayes is with us, member of City Council in Chesapeake. Cliff can stand. Are there any other elected officials that came in that I didn't see? Thank you.